The ship had been drifting for 3 days. When it finally scraped into the harbour at Messina, Sicily, in October of 1347, the dock workers who rushed to meet it stopped cold. The vessel had come from the Black Sea ports of the east, and it carried cargo, but it also carried something else. The sailors still on board were barely alive. Their skin was covered in strange black swellings, oozing blood and pus. Those who could still speak were delirious with fever. Many were already dead at their oars. The port authorities of Messina made a decision that was, given the circumstances, entirely rational. They ordered the ships out of the harbour immediately. Turn around. Go back. You are not welcome here. It was too late. Within days, people in Messina began to fall ill. Within weeks, the disease had spread to Catania. Within months, it was moving north through Italy, east into Greece, west toward France and Spain. By the time it reached England in 1348 and Scandinavia and Poland by 1350, somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population was dead. Let that number settle for a moment. Not 30 to 60% of an army, not 30 to 60% of a city. 30 to 60% of an entire civilization. In raw numbers, historians estimate that somewhere between 25 and 50 million people died in Europe alone in roughly 5 years. Globally, across Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, where the plague had already been killing for years before it reached those Sicilian docks, the death toll may have reached 75 million or more. This was not a war, it was not a famine. It was a bacterium, smaller than anything the medieval mind could conceive of, and it very nearly broke the world. But here is the part that makes the Black Death genuinely extraordinary, beyond the sheer scale of death, what came after. The plague did not just kill people, it killed a way of life. It shattered the social, economic, religious, and intellectual foundations of medieval Europe so completely that what emerged from the wreckage was something recognizably different, a world moving, haltingly and painfully, toward the Renaissance, toward capitalism, toward the questioning of authority that would eventually produce the Reformation and the scientific revolution. The Black Death is one of those rare events in history where catastrophe and transformation are so tightly bound together that you cannot understand one without the other. To understand why Europe became what it became, you have to understand what it was like to live through the worst pandemic in recorded human history. So let us go back, not to those docks in Messina, but further to the place where this story actually begins. Somewhere in the grasslands of Central Asia, probably in the region around Lake Issyk-Kul, in what is now Kyrgyzstan, something changed in the population of wild rodents. The exact origin of the Black Death pandemic is still debated among historians and scientists, but archaeological and genetic evidence points to this region in the late 1330s or early 1340s as the likely starting point. Researchers examining medieval cemeteries near Lake Issyk-Kul have found inscriptions from 1338 and 1339, noting an unusual number of deaths, a possible early signal of what was coming. The bacterium responsible was Yersinia pestis, and it had existed in rodent populations for thousands of years. It is still out there today. In fact, living quietly in prairie dog colonies in the American Southwest and in wild rodents across Central Asia, which is why plague still kills a small number of people every year. But in the 14th century, something, possibly a climate shift, possibly a disruption to rodent populations, caused it to spill over into new hosts, spread to new regions, and eventually find its way into the one creature that would carry it everywhere: the black rat. Rats were ubiquitous in the medieval world. They lived in granaries, on ships, in the walls of homes, in markets and monasteries and royal palaces, and the rats carried fleas, and the fleas carried Yersinia pestis. When a flea bit a rat and then bit a human, it could inject the bacterium directly into the bloodstream. From there, the bacteria traveled to the lymph nodes, where they multiplied rapidly, causing the grotesque swellings, called buboes, from the Greek word for groin, where they often first appeared, that gave the disease one of its names, the bubonic plague. But bubonic plague was not the only form Yersinia pestis could take. When the infection spread to the lungs, it became pneumonic plague, transmissible directly through the air, through coughs and breath, no flea required. This form was almost universally fatal and could spread with terrifying speed in crowded conditions. There was also a septicemic form, where the bacteria entered the bloodstream so rapidly that victims could die before the characteristic buboes even had time to form. Medieval people, of course, knew none of this. They had no concept of bacteria, no germ theory, no understanding of how disease actually spread. What they had were theories, and the theories they reached for were the ones their world had given them. The most widespread explanation was divine punishment. God was angry. The sins of humanity had accumulated to such a degree that the Lord had unleashed this pestilence as a warning, a correction, a judgment. This was not a fringe view held by the uneducated. It was the dominant interpretation offered by the church, by scholars, by the most learned men of the age. And it had a logic to it, given what people believed about the world. If God governed all things, and if plague was clearly not a natural event in any ordinary sense, then it must be supernatural in origin. The medical faculty of the University of Paris, asked by the French king to explain the epidemic, produced a formal report in 1348 attributing the plague to a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius in 1345, which had caused a corruption of the air. This miasma theory, the idea that bad air, emanating from rotting matter or from celestial disturbances, caused disease, was the dominant medical framework of the era, inherited from ancient Greek medicine and refined over centuries. It was wrong, but it was not stupid. It was the best available explanation given what people knew. The tragedy is that acting on these theories sometimes made things worse. If the plague was spread through bad air, then lighting bonfires to purify the atmosphere made sense, and people did this, crowding around fires in public spaces, which brought them into closer contact with each other and with infected rats. If the plague was divine punishment, then public processions of flagellants, whipping themselves bloody in acts of collective penance, made spiritual sense, and these processions moved from town to town, carrying the disease with them. And then there were the Jews. In one of the darkest chapters of the Black Death, rumors spread that the plague had been caused by Jews poisoning the wells. There was no basis for this whatsoever. Jews were dying from the plague at the same rates as everyone else, though some communities may have had slightly lower rates due to religious hygiene practices, which only fueled suspicion. But logic had little power against fear and scapegoating. Beginning in 1348 and continuing through 1351, Jewish communities across Germany, France, Switzerland and the Low Countries were attacked, massacred and expelled. In Strasbourg, an estimated 2,000 Jews were burned alive in February 1349, before the plague had even reached the city, a preemptive massacre driven by paranoia and greed. In Mainz and Cologne, in Basel and Erfurt, the pattern repeated. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls condemning the violence and explicitly stating that Jews were not responsible for the plague, but the massacres continued. These pogroms drove Jewish populations eastward into Poland and Lithuania, where rulers offered protection in exchange for the economic activity that Jewish merchants and financiers brought. This demographic shift would shape the geography of Jewish settlement in Europe for the next 5 centuries. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand what the plague destroyed and what it created, we need to understand the world it entered, because that world was already under enormous stress. Europe in the early 14th century was, in many respects, at the peak of its medieval development. The great cathedrals were rising, universities were flourishing, trade networks connected the Mediterranean to the North Sea. The population had been growing steadily for 3 centuries, doubling and in some regions tripling since the year 1000. But that growth had created its own vulnerabilities. By 1300, Europe was, in the assessment of most historians, dangerously overpopulated relative to its agricultural capacity. The best farmland had long been under cultivation. Marginal land, hillsides, wetlands, thin soils had been brought under the plough to feed the growing numbers. But marginal land produces marginal yields, and the agricultural technology of the era had not kept pace with demand. The result was a civilization operating very close to the edge. Then, between 1315 and 1322, came the Great Famine. A series of catastrophically wet summers across northern Europe destroyed harvests year after year. People ate their seed grain, then their livestock, then things that were not really food at all. Mortality was severe, perhaps 10 to 15% of the population in the worst affected regions. Survivors were weakened. The social fabric was strained. Trust in institutions, in the church, in kings and lords, in the idea that the world was ordered and comprehensible, had already taken a blow. The Black Death arrived into this already stressed world like a fire into a drought-parched forest. There is a letter written by the Italian poet Petrarch in 1349. after the plague had killed his beloved Laura and many of his closest friends. He wrote to a friend, "When has any such thing been even heard or seen? In what annals has it ever been read that houses were left vacant, cities deserted, the country neglected, the fields too small for the dead, and a fearful and universal solitude over the whole earth?" Petrarch was not prone to understatement, but in this case, he was barely keeping up with reality. The chronicles of the time read like dispatches from a world coming apart. Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague in Florence and later wrote about it in the introduction to his Decameron, described a city where the social bonds that normally held civilization together simply dissolved. People abandoned their sick relatives. Neighbors refused to help neighbors. The dying were left to die alone, their bodies dragged out into the streets because there was no one to perform proper burial rites. Dogs and pigs rooted through corpses in the open air. Boccaccio describes the Florentine death toll as 100,000 people in the city alone. Modern historians think this is an overestimate, but Florence did lose perhaps half its population, somewhere between 45 and 65,000 people in a matter of months. The city went from being one of the wealthiest and most culturally vibrant places in Europe to a charnel house, and Florence was not exceptional, it was typical. In Paris, chroniclers recorded that 500 people a day were dying at the peak of the epidemic. The Hôtel Dieu, the city's main hospital, was so overwhelmed that patients were sharing beds, the dying lying next to those not yet infected, the dead remaining in the beds long after life had left them because there was no one available to remove them. The monks and nuns who staffed the hospital died in enormous numbers, their vows of care for the sick meaning they were constantly exposed to the most infectious environment in the city. In England, the plague arrived in the summer of 1348, probably through the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. It moved north and west with methodical devastation. Some villages lost a third of their population, others lost 2/3. A few were simply emptied, the survivors fleeing, the dead unburied, the buildings left to slowly collapse back into the earth. These lost villages of England, of which there are hundreds, are still visible today as crop marks and earthworks in fields that have been farmland for 600 years. The clergy were hit especially hard because their duties, administering last rites, visiting the sick, burying the dead, brought them into constant contact with the infected. In some English dioceses, the mortality rate among the clergy exceeded 40%. The church responded by lowering its standards for ordination, accepting men with less training to fill the gaps. This would have long-term consequences for the intellectual quality of parish clergy and for the resentments that would eventually fuel the Reformation. In rural areas, the death of so many agricultural laborers created a crisis that would, paradoxically, plant the seeds of eventual liberation for the survivors. But before we get to the transformation, we need to sit a little longer with the devastation, because the scale of what happened is genuinely difficult to absorb, and understanding it emotionally is as important as understanding it intellectually. Imagine a village of 300 people. You know everyone. You have grown up alongside these families, worshipped in the same church, worked the same fields. Over the course of about 6 months, 120 of them are dead, maybe more. The priest who baptized you is dead. The midwife who delivered your children is dead. The blacksmith, the miller, the Lord's steward, dead, dead, dead. Children who were healthy in spring are in the ground by autumn. Old men who seemed indestructible are gone in days. The randomness of it is maddening. Some families are nearly wiped out while the family next door loses no one, and there is no visible reason why. The psychological impact of this was profound and lasting, and it expressed itself in ways that reshaped European culture for generations. The most visible cultural expression of the Black Death's psychological impact was the danse macabre, the dance of death. This motif, which appeared in art, literature, and dramatic performance throughout the late 14th and 15th centuries, depicted death as a skeleton or a skeletal figure leading a procession of people from all walks of life, pope and peasant, king and beggar, young and old, in a dance toward the grave. The message was explicit and democratic. Death comes for everyone, regardless of rank or wealth or piety. No one is exempt. This was a genuinely radical idea in a hierarchical medieval society where rank was supposed to reflect divine order. If a king and a serf died the same death, suffered the same agony, rotted in the same earth, what did that say about the divine order? What did it say about the Church's promise that righteous living would be rewarded, These were not comfortable questions, and the Church did not have comfortable answers. The crisis of faith that the Black Death triggered was not immediate or universal. Many people responded to the plague with intensified religious devotion, more prayer, more pilgrimage, more donations to the Church, more extreme acts of penance. The flagellant movement, in which groups of men traveled from town to town publicly whipping themselves to atone for the sins they believed had caused the plague, spread rapidly across Germany and the Low Countries in 1348 and 1349. At its peak, flagellant processions were attracting enormous crowds, and the movement was developing a theology that was, from the Church's perspective, dangerously unorthodox, claiming that the flagellant's self-mortification could secure salvation independently of the Church's sacraments. Pope Clement VI condemned the flagellants in October 1349, and the movement was suppressed. But the impulse behind it, the sense that the Church's ordinary channels were inadequate, that something more direct and more personal was needed to reach God, did not go away. It went underground, and it simmered. The Black Death did not cause the Reformation. That would be too simple. But it created a spiritual hunger that the institutional Church increasingly failed to satisfy. And it created a generation of people who had watched the Church's representatives die alongside everyone else, who had seen bishops flee their dioceses, while the poor were left to die without last rites, who had been told that the plague was God's punishment and had prayed and fasted and flagellated themselves and watched the dying continue regardless. That generation, and the generations that followed, were more open to questioning than their grandparents had been. There is a direct line, long, winding but traceable, from the mass graves of 1348 to Martin Luther nailing his theses to a door in 1517. But the religious transformation, as significant as it was only one dimension of what the Black Death changed. To understand the full scope of the transformation, we need to talk about economics and about the single most important shift in medieval European society that the plague made possible. Here is one of the great ironies of the Black Death. For the people who survived it, life often got materially better. This seems almost obscene to say. It requires immediate qualification. The survivors had lived through a trauma of almost incomprehensible proportions. Many had lost everyone they loved. The psychological and spiritual damage was real and deep, but the economic logic of what followed is undeniable, and understanding it is essential to understanding why the plague was a turning point and not just a catastrophe. Medieval European society was built on a foundation of surplus labor. There were more people than there were good jobs, good land, or good opportunities. This imbalance of supply and demand gave power to the landowners and employers, the nobility and the Church, and kept the peasantry in a condition of structural vulnerability. Serfdom, which bound agricultural laborers to the land they worked and to the lord who owned that land, was the legal expression of this power imbalance. Even where formal serfdom had weakened, wages were low, rents were high, and the options available to ordinary people were severely constrained. The Black Death killed, at minimum, a third of the labor force. In many regions, it killed half or more. Overnight, and this is not a metaphor, the shift happened with remarkable speed. The balance of power between labor and capital inverted. There were not enough workers to farm the land. Lords who had previously been able to dictate terms to their tenants now found themselves competing for laborers. Fields that had been under cultivation for generations went fallow because there was no one to work them. Wages rose, rents fell. Serfs who had been legally bound to their manors began to leave, moving to towns or to other estates that offered better terms, and their lords often lacked the practical ability to stop them. In England, the government tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels through the Statute of Labourers in 1351. It was an attempt by the surviving elite to use law to undo what the plague had done to the labour market. It largely failed. Wages continued to rise. Labourers continued to move. The frustration of the labouring classes at being told, in effect, that they should be grateful to work for the same wages as before while their neighbours were dead. This frustration was a direct cause of the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, one of the largest popular uprisings in medieval English history. Wat Tyler and John Ball, the leaders of the 1381 revolt, were not plague survivors themselves, but they were the children and grandchildren of plague survivors, and they were articulating grievances that had been building since 1348. John Ball's famous question, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" was a direct challenge to the hierarchical order that the Black Death had already begun to undermine in practice. If death took everyone equally, Why should the living be unequal? The revolt was suppressed, as most medieval revolts were, but the underlying forces it expressed continued to work. By the end of the 15th century, serfdom had effectively disappeared from most of Western Europe. Not because of any legal abolition, not because of any revolution, but because the demographic catastrophe of the plague had shifted the economic ground beneath the old order's feet so completely that it could no longer sustain itself. This is one of the Black Death's most important legacies. It accelerated the end of medieval feudalism in Western Europe by roughly a century, possibly more. The economic disruption went beyond agriculture. The plague killed artisans, merchants, bankers, and craftsmen alongside peasants. In the cities, where population density made the death rates even higher, entire industries were disrupted. But the cities recovered faster than the countryside, and they recovered in interesting ways. The death of so many skilled craftsmen created opportunities for survivors to move into trades that had previously been closed to them by guild restrictions. Women in particular entered skilled trades in greater numbers in the decades after the plague, because the guilds needed workers and the old rules about who could join could not be rigidly enforced when half the members were dead. This was not a feminist revolution. The restrictions came back as population recovered, but it was a window, however temporary, into a different kind of social organization. The concentration of inherited wealth in fewer hands, because so many heirs had died, created a new class of relatively prosperous survivors who had more disposable income than their parents had ever had. This fed demand for luxury goods, for art, for books, for the kinds of cultural products that we associate with the late medieval and early Renaissance periods. There is a direct economic connection between the mass death of the 1040s and the cultural flowering of the late 14th and 15th centuries. And then there is the question of land. When a family died out entirely, their land reverted to their lord or was claimed by whoever could make the best case for it. The plague created an enormous reshuffling of property across Europe. Some of this land ended up consolidated in the hands of great lords, but some of it ended up in the hands of ambitious peasants and minor gentry who were quick enough and lucky enough to acquire it. The social mobility that the plague made possible, downward for the unlucky, upward for the survivors, with the wit to seize opportunity, began to erode the rigid stratification of medieval society in ways that would take generations to fully express themselves. We have been talking about Western Europe, but the Black Death did not respect geographic boundaries. And understanding what happened in other parts of the world during the same period is important for appreciating the full scope of the event. The plague had been killing in Asia for years before it reached Europe. Chinese chronicles record enormous mortality in the 1330s and 1340s, though the exact figures are impossible to verify. The Mongol Empire, which at its height had stretched from the Pacific to the borders of Poland, had already been fragmenting under various pressures, and the plague accelerated that fragmentation. The Khanate in Persia effectively collapsed. The Golden Horde, the Mongol successor state that controlled the western steppes and much of Russia, was severely weakened, a fact that would eventually allow the Principality of Moscow to begin asserting independence. The Islamic world was struck with devastating force. Egypt, one of the wealthiest and most populous regions of the medieval world, may have lost a third of its population. The Mamluk Sultanate, which had been one of the most formidable military powers in the world, the force that had stopped the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, was permanently weakened. The economic and demographic decline of Egypt and the Levant contributed to a long-term shift in the balance of power between the Islamic world and Europe that would play out over the following centuries. The Byzantine Empire, already reduced to a shadow of its former self, was struck at a moment when it could least afford it. Constantinople lost perhaps half its population. The empire, which had been limping along for a century, never fully recovered. When the Ottoman Turks finally took Constantinople in 1453, they were conquering a city that the Black Death had already half emptied and half broken. One region that largely escaped the worst of the plague, at least in the first wave, was sub-Saharan Africa. The disease does not appear to have penetrated significantly south of the Sahara. This was partly geography and partly the nature of the trade routes that carried the plague. But it meant that while Europe, the Middle East and Asia were being devastated, the great kingdoms of West and East Africa, Mali, Zimbabwe, the Swahili city-states continued to develop without the disruption their northern counterparts were experiencing. This divergence in historical experience would have long-term consequences for the relative positions of different civilizations in the centuries that followed. Let us return to Europe and to one of the most fascinating and underappreciated consequences of the Black Death: its effect on the intellectual and scientific life of the continent. The plague was, in a sense, the greatest scientific challenge medieval Europe had ever faced, and it exposed with brutal clarity the inadequacy of the existing intellectual frameworks for understanding the natural world. The miasma theory did not explain why some people got sick and others did not. The astrological explanation did not explain why the plague came back in waves. The theological explanation, divine punishment, raised uncomfortable questions about why the righteous died alongside the sinful, and why prayer and penance seemed to have no effect on the course of the disease. These failures did not immediately produce a scientific revolution. The Black Death did not cause people to suddenly abandon Aristotle and Galen and start doing controlled experiments. History does not work that way. But it planted seeds of doubt about received authority, about the reliability of ancient texts, about whether the explanations that the educated class offered for natural phenomena were actually correct. There is a generation of physicians who survived the Black Death and wrote about their experience, and reading their accounts is striking. Some of them clung rigidly to the old frameworks, doubling down on miasma theory and astrological explanation. But others, and this is the interesting group, began to observe more carefully, to note what seemed to correlate with infection and what did not, to question whether the standard treatments were actually helping. They could not arrive at germ theory, that would require microscopes and a conceptual framework that was centuries away, but they were moving, however haltingly, toward empirical observation as a method. The Black Death also had a profound effect on medical education. The shortage of physicians created by the plague led to an expansion of medical schools and a loosening of restrictions on medical practice. More importantly, the obvious failure of book learning to deal with the plague pushed medical education toward more practical training, including, and this is significant, the dissection of human bodies. Human dissection had been practiced in European medical schools since the early 14th century, but it was still relatively rare and sometimes controversial. In the decades after the plague, as physicians struggled to understand what was happening inside the bodies of the dead, dissection became more common and more accepted. This was one of the intellectual foundations of the anatomical revolution of the 16th century, when Andreas Vesalius would produce his great work on human anatomy and overturn centuries of error inherited from Galen. The connection is not direct. But the Black Death made the medical establishment more willing to look at actual bodies rather than ancient texts, and that shift in orientation from authority to observation was one of the earliest stirrings of what we now call the scientific revolution. Now we come to one of the most important wow moments in the entire story of the Black Death, and it has to do with a village in England called Iam. This is not a story from 1348. It is a story from 1665 and 1666, when the plague returned to England in one of its periodic resurgences. The same disease, the same bacterium, 3 centuries later. I am telling you about it here because it illustrates, in the most vivid possible way, the human capacity for courage and sacrifice in the face of epidemic disease. In September 1665, a box of cloth arrived in the village of Iam, Derbyshire, from London, where plague was raging. The tailor who opened it was dead within a week. The plague had arrived. What happened next was extraordinary. The village rector, William Mompesson, and the former rector, Thomas Stanley, who were, incidentally, theological rivals, one Anglican and one nonconformist, together persuaded the villagers to quarantine themselves voluntarily. Do not leave, do not spread this to the surrounding villages. Stay and die if you must, but do not carry this beyond our boundaries. The villagers agreed. For 14 months, Iam sealed itself off from the world. Food and supplies were left at boundary stones at the edge of the village, paid for with coins left in vinegar-filled holes in the rock, because people believed vinegar purified money of infection. The villagers died, 260 of them, out of a population of perhaps 750. Entire families were wiped out. Elizabeth Hancock buried 6 children and her husband in 8 days, digging the graves herself because there was no one else to do it. But the surrounding villages were spared. Iam is famous today as the village that sacrificed itself, but I want you to think about what it actually represents in the context of the Black Death. In 1348, people had no framework for understanding quarantine as a rational response to epidemic disease. By 1665, even ordinary villagers in a small English settlement had absorbed enough understanding of how plague spread through contact, through travel, through trade goods, to make a rational collective decision to contain it. That knowledge, built up through centuries of observation and bitter experience, saved lives. This is one of the long-term legacies of the Black Death. It taught Europe, at enormous cost, the practical basics of epidemic control. Quarantine, as a formal public health measure, was developed in the Italian city-states in direct response to the plague. Venice established the first formal quarantine system in 1377, requiring ships arriving from plague-affected areas to anchor offshore for 30 days before their crews could land. The word quarantine comes from the Italian quarantina, meaning 40 days. The period was later extended from 30 to 40. This was not based on germ theory. It was based on observation. People who had been exposed to the plague but were not yet sick sometimes became sick within a month. If you kept them isolated for long enough, you could tell whether they were infected. This was empirical public health, developed from necessity, and it worked. The Italian city-states that implemented quarantine measures most rigorously had lower mortality in subsequent plague waves than those that did not. The lesson was learned imperfectly and inconsistently, but it was learned. There is another dimension of the Black Death's legacy that deserves careful attention, because it is both important and often overlooked: its effect on language and literature. The late 14th century, in the immediate aftermath of the Black Death, was one of the most creatively fertile periods in the history of European literature. This seems paradoxical. How do you produce great literature in the aftermath of mass death? But trauma, it turns out, is one of the great engines of artistic creation, and the Black Death produced writers who were grappling in real time with questions of mortality, meaning social order and divine justice that had been forced into sharp focus by what they had witnessed. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the early 1350s, frames its 100 stories within the context of the plague. A group of young Florentines flee to a country villa to escape the epidemic and tell each other stories to pass the time. The framing device is not incidental. Boccaccio is writing about survival, about the human need for narrative and connection in the face of death, about the comedy and tragedy of human life seen from the perspective of someone who has watched civilization come very close to the edge. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer, born around 1343, a child during the first wave of the plague, wrote the Canterbury Tales, another collection of stories told by a group of travellers. Chaucer's work is saturated with the social upheaval of the post-plague world. His characters include people from every level of society, from knights to millers to nuns to merchants, and they interact with a fluidity and irreverence that would have been unthinkable in the more rigidly hierarchical world before the plague. The knight's tale sits alongside the miller's tale. The pardonner's cynical manipulation of religious sentiment is exposed rather than condemned. This is a world where the old certainties have been shaken. William Langland's Piers Plowman, also written in the second half of the 14th century, is a long allegorical poem about the search for salvation in a corrupt and suffering world. It is explicitly concerned with the social dislocation of the post-plague period, the shortage of labourers, the rising wages, the breakdown of the old social contract between lords and peasants. Langland was not happy about these changes. He was a conservative who wanted the old order restored. But his poem is a vivid document of a world in transition. And then there is the German mystic tradition. Meister Eckhart had died just before the plague, but his students, Johannes Tauler and Heinrich Suso, lived through it and wrote in its aftermath. Their mysticism, with its emphasis on the direct personal experience of God unmediated by institutional structures, was in part a response to the spiritual crisis the plague had created. The Church's sacramental machinery had been overwhelmed. Priests had died or fled. The ordinary channels of grace had broken down. In this context, the mystics' insistence that God could be found within the individual soul, without the mediation of priests or sacraments, had an obvious appeal. This mystical tradition would feed directly into the Devotio Moderna movement of the late 14th and early 15th centuries, and through it into the humanism of Erasmus and the reforming impulse of Luther. The spiritual hunger that the plague created, and that the institutional church failed to satisfy, found expression in forms that would eventually break the church's monopoly on European religious life. We are now 3/4 of the way through this story, and I want to pause for a moment and acknowledge something important. Everything I have told you about the Black Death's long-term consequences, the end of feudalism, the rise of empirical medicine, the spiritual crisis that fed the Reformation, the literary flowering, all of this is real and well documented. But there is a risk, in telling history this way, of making catastrophe seem purposeful, of implying that the millions who died somehow died for a reason, that their deaths were necessary for progress. They were not. There was nothing necessary or inevitable about the Black Death. It was a bacterium. It had no purpose. The people who died in the mass graves of 1348 and 1349 were not sacrifices to historical progress. They were people who loved their children and feared death and wanted to live, and they died in agony, often alone, often without the comfort of the religious rites that their culture told them were necessary for salvation. The transformation that came after the Black Death was not a silver lining. It was what happened when humanity, collectively and individually, tried to rebuild a world that had been shattered. Some of what was rebuilt was better than what had been destroyed. Some of it was not. All of it was the work of people trying to make sense of something that had no inherent sense. This is worth keeping in mind as we come to the question of legacy. The Black Death did not end in 1350. This is another thing that is important to understand. The plague became endemic in Europe. It came back, in waves, for the next 300 years. The second pandemic hit in the 1360s, killing perhaps 10 to 15% of the surviving population. It came back again in the 1370s and again in the 1380s. The Great Plague of London in 1665 was one of the last major outbreaks in England. The Plague of Marseille in 1720 was one of the last in Western Europe. It was not until the mid-18th century that Europe was finally free of regular plague epidemics, and historians are still not entirely sure why. Some theories point to the gradual replacement of the black rat, Rattus rattus, which lived in close proximity to humans, by the brown rat, Rattus norvegicus, which tended to live in sewers and cellars rather than in the walls of homes. Some point to improvements in housing. The shift from timber and thatch to stone and brick made it harder for rats to nest in walls. Some point to possible genetic selection, where people whose immune systems were better equipped to fight Yersinia pestis survived in greater numbers and passed their resistance on. This last theory has produced one of the most genuinely surprising scientific discoveries connected to the Black Death, a genetic variant called the CCR5 delta 32 mutation, which appears to confer some resistance to certain diseases, is found at significantly higher rates in European populations than in populations with no history of plague exposure. This mutation also, intriguingly, confers resistance to HIV infection. Some researchers have suggested that the high frequency of this mutation in European populations is a direct legacy of the Black Death, that the plague, by killing those without the mutation at higher rates, inadvertently selected for a genetic variant that would, 6 centuries later, protect some Europeans from a completely different epidemic. This is not settled science. The connection between CCR5 delta 32 and plague resistance is real but contested among researchers, and the degree to which the Black Death drove the frequency of this mutation is debated. But it is a striking example of how an event in the 14th century can have consequences that reach into the biology of people alive today. So what is the final accounting? What did the Black Death actually do to Europe, and why does it matter? Let us be precise, because precision matters here. The Black Death killed, in Europe alone, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people in roughly 5 years. The lower and upper bounds of the estimate reflecting genuine uncertainty in the historical record. It reduced Europe's total population to a level it would not recover to for more than a century, possibly a century and a half. The demographic recovery was slow because the plague kept coming back, because the survivors were often traumatized and socially disrupted, and because the economic and agricultural systems that had supported the pre-plague population had been severely damaged. In the short term, the Black Death was an unambiguous catastrophe. The suffering was real and immense, and no amount of subsequent historical analysis can change that. In the medium term, over the following century, the Black Death accelerated changes that were already underway in European society, and triggered changes that would not otherwise have happened, or would have happened much more slowly. The decline of serfdom, the rise of wage labor, the growth of a more mobile, more commercially oriented economy, the weakening of the Church's cultural authority, the opening of intellectual space for questioning received wisdom. In the long term, over the following 2 to 3 centuries, these medium-term changes contributed to the conditions that made the Renaissance, the Reformation, and eventually the scientific revolution possible. This is not a simple causal chain. The Renaissance would not have happened without the Black Death, but the Black Death alone did not cause the Renaissance. History is not that simple. What the plague did was help create conditions, economic, social, intellectual, spiritual, that were more favorable to the kind of questioning, experimenting, and reimagining of the world that we associate with the early modern period. There is one more thing worth saying, and it is perhaps the most important thing of all. The Black Death is the most dramatic example in human history of what epidemiologists call a bottleneck event, a catastrophic reduction in population that reshapes everything that follows. But it is not unique in kind, only in scale. Human history is full of epidemics, of diseases that crossed borders and killed populations that had no immunity. The smallpox that devastated the indigenous populations of the Americas after European contact. The influenza pandemic of 1918, which killed more people than the First World War. The ongoing HIV/AIDS epidemic, which has killed more than 40 million people since the 1980s. Each of these events, like the Black Death, was both a catastrophe and a turning point. Each of them revealed, with brutal clarity, the vulnerabilities of the societies they struck. Each of them forced survivors to rebuild, and in rebuilding to make choices about what kind of world they wanted to live in. The Black Death did not teach Europe easy lessons. It taught hard ones, paid for in mass graves and abandoned villages and centuries of recurring fear, but it taught them. And the world that emerged from the wreckage of the 14th century, fractured, traumatized, but also more mobile, more questioning, more aware of the fragility of the structures that human beings build to make sense of the world, was a world that would, over the next 2 centuries, produce Leonardo da Vinci and Copernicus, Gutenberg and Columbus, Shakespeare and Galileo. None of them would have existed without the Black Death. Not because the plague was good, but because history is made by survivors, and the survivors of the 14th century had been through something that stripped away illusions and forced a reckoning with reality that ultimately changed everything. The ships that drifted into Messina in October 1347 carried death, but they also, in a way that no one on those docks could possibly have imagined, carried the seeds of a new world. That is the story of the Black Death, or at least the beginning of it. Because the truth is, we have barely scratched the surface. We have not talked about the specific experience of individual cities, the extraordinary story of how Venice used the plague to become the most sophisticated public health system in medieval Europe, or how Florence's recovery from the plague was directly connected to the patronage of the Medici family and the cultural explosion of the early Renaissance. We have not talked about the plague's effect on the 100 Years' War between England and France, which was being fought at exactly the same time and was profoundly disrupted by the epidemic. We have not talked about the specific strains of Yersinia pestis that caused the Black Death, and what modern genetic analysis of medieval plague victims has revealed about how the disease spread across Europe. There is so much more to explore. If this video made you think differently about the Black Death, if you came in thinking of it as just a medieval catastrophe, and you are leaving with a sense of it as one of the great turning points in human history, then we have done something worthwhile together. If you want to go deeper, the next video in this series looks at the Renaissance, how the cultural, economic, and intellectual transformation that the plague set in motion expressed itself in the art, architecture, and ideas of 15th century Italy. It is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of human civilization, and understanding the Black Death makes it make sense in a way that it simply does not if you come to it without this context. Leave a comment below telling me which aspect of the Black Death surprised you most. Was it the economic transformation? The connection to the Reformation? The I Am story? The genetic legacy? I read every comment, and your responses genuinely shape what I cover next. If this is your first video on the channel, subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover the great turning points of human history, the moments when everything changed, and we try to do it with the seriousness and the storytelling that these stories deserve. The history is real, the stakes were real. And understanding it matters more than you might think.